There's something unsettling about the unknown, the things that lurk in the shadows, just beyond the edges of our reality. Tonight, I have a story for you, one that will creep into your thoughts long after the lights go out. So sit back, turn down the lights, and let me take you into a world where fear is more than just a feeling. It's real. Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller. Let's begin. Whispers in the woods. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not the peaceful, tranquil silence of a quiet suburb, but a thick, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums. I'd bought the cabin as a retreat, a place to escape the city's relentless hum. But this was different. This was the silence of isolation. The cabin itself was a relic. Log walls, a steeply pitched roof, and a porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. It sat nestled deep within the woods, miles from the nearest town. The real estate agent had called it rustic and charming. I was starting to suspect those were euphemisms for dilapidated and creepy. The first few days were spent settling in, or trying to. The generator coughed and sputtered, providing just enough electricity to power a few lights. There was no cell service, which I'd initially thought would be a blessing, quickly became a source of anxiety. The nearest landline was a 10-mile drive down a winding dirt road. I felt cut off, adrift. The woods themselves seemed to watch me. Towering pines and gnarled oaks formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, the cabin was shrouded in a perpetual twilight. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, playing tricks on my eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a shiver down my spine. Then there was the neighbor, an old woman named Michelle. Her cabin was a little further into the woods, barely visible through the trees. She appeared on my third day, seemingly out of nowhere. One moment the path was empty, the next she was standing on my porch, a small woven basket in her hands. She was unsettling. Her eyes were too bright, too intense, and they seemed to pierce right through me. She wore a long, dark dress that looked like it belonged in a museum, and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, revealing a face etched with wrinkles. "Welcome to the woods," she said, her voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She offered me the basket. Inside were a few jars of preserves, some freshly baked bread, and a small, hand-carved wooden owl. "A gift," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "From the woods." I thanked her, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and unease. As she turned to leave, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the cabin. "Keep your lamps full," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your windows closed, and your mind sharper than your axe." Then she was gone, disappearing back into the trees as silently as she had come. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I watched her go, the wooden owl clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't understand what she meant, but her warning sent a chill down my spine. It felt less like a neighborly welcome and more like a prophecy. That night, I checked all the windows, making sure they were securely locked. I filled the oil lamps and placed them strategically around the cabin. I even sharpened my axe, a tool I hadn't touched since I arrived. I tried to dismiss her words as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman, but a nagging feeling of dread settled in my stomach. Something about her, something about the woods, made me believe that her warning was more than just idle chatter. Something was out there. I just didn't know what. The following days were filled with a growing sense of unease. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, made my heart pound. I started to feel like I was being watched. Michelle remained an enigma. She would appear occasionally, always bearing gifts. More preserves, fresh eggs, once even a small, intricately woven dream catcher. Each time, she would repeat her cryptic warning. "Keep your lamps full, your windows closed, and your mind sharper than your axe." I tried to ask her what she meant, but she would just smile, a knowing, unsettling smile, and disappear back into the woods. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin, I heard a noise. A faint scratching sound coming from outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. It sounded like something dragging its claws across the wooden walls. I grabbed my axe, my hand trembling. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the window. Peeking through the gap in the curtains, I saw nothing. The woods were silent, still. The scratching had stopped. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It must have been an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe, or a stray dog. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The scratching had sounded deliberate, like something testing the strength of the cabin walls. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every whisper of wind, kept me awake. I lay in bed, clutching my axe, my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The next morning, I decided to visit Michelle. I needed to understand what was going on. I needed to know what her warnings meant. Her cabin was even more dilapidated than mine. The porch sagged precariously, the windows were boarded up, and the roof looked like it could collapse at any moment. The air around the cabin felt heavy, oppressive. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, and the door creaked open. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Michelle wasn't there. I called out her name, but only silence answered me. I wandered through the cabin, my footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards. There was something unsettling about the place, a feeling of wrongness. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on a small table in the corner. A photograph. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the dusty glass. It was a picture of Michelle, but she looked much younger, maybe in her 20s. She was standing in front of a different cabin, one that looked newer, more well-maintained. And beside her, in the photograph, was a man. A tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a cruel smile. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about the man in the photograph that made my blood run cold. I had a feeling I'd seen him before. Then it hit me. The man. He was the same man I'd seen in my dreams. A recurring nightmare I'd had since moving into the cabin. A man standing in the shadows, watching me. I put the photograph back on the table, my hand shaking. I had to get out of there. I turned and fled the cabin. The image of the man's face burned into my mind. I ran all the way back to my own cabin, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and filled the lamps. I felt a sense of panic rising inside me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that I was in danger. I knew that something was coming. And then I saw her, standing in the woods, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Michelle. She was staring at my cabin, her eyes glowing in the darkness. She raised her hand and beckoned to me. I didn't move. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was coming, it was already too late to run. I didn't go to her. I couldn't. The fear that gripped me was too powerful, too consuming. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching Michelle, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. She continued to beckon, her movements slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me, burning into me. Then, something moved in the trees behind her. A dark shape, hulking and indistinct, shifted in the darkness. It was larger than a human, larger than any animal I knew. It moved with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew, instinctively, that it was something ancient, something evil. The shape emerged from the trees, stepping into the dim light cast by the moon. It was a man. The man from the photograph. The man from my nightmares. He was tall and gaunt, with long, stringy hair that hung down to his shoulders. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, and his lips were curved into a cruel, predatory smile. He raised his hand, pointing directly at me. A jolt of pure terror shot through me. I knew then that I was the prey. I was the hunted. Michelle turned to face the man, and for a moment they stood together, silhouetted against the dark forest. They looked like figures from a nightmare, creatures of darkness. Then, the man began to walk towards my cabin, his movements slow, deliberate, each step measured. I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay there, paralyzed by fear. I grabbed my axe, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I fumbled with the latch on the back door, desperate to find an escape. The door creaked open, and I slipped out into the darkness. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the cabin, away from them. I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps muffled by the leaves, but I knew he was gaining on me. I stumbled through the woods, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I could hear the man's breath now, ragged and heavy, close behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him. He was closer now, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, his smile wider, more menacing. I tripped over a root and fell to the ground, my axe clattering away. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The man was upon me. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip like iron. I screamed, but no sound came out. He pulled me towards him, his face inches from mine. I could smell his breath. It was cold and stale, like the air in a tomb. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "This is our woods now." He raised his other hand, and I saw something glinting in the moonlight. A knife, a long, sharp knife. I closed my eyes, bracing for the pain, but it never came. Instead, I heard a sound, a snapping twig. The man stiffened, his grip on my arm loosening. He turned his head, his eyes widening in surprise. Then, I heard another sound, a low growl, a growl that sent shivers down my spine. It was a growl that spoke of power, of rage, of something ancient and untamed. The man turned back to me, his face contorted in a mask of fear. He released my arm and took a step back. He looked from me to the trees, his eyes darting back and forth. And then, I saw it, moving in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A pair of eyes, glowing eyes. They were not human eyes. They were larger, more luminous, and they burned with an intense, otherworldly light. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. The man turned and ran, disappearing back into the trees as quickly as he had come. I lay there on the ground, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew it had saved me. I knew that something else was out there in the woods, something even more terrifying than the man. I got to my feet, my legs still shaky. I found my axe and clutched it tightly. I didn't know what to do. I was lost, alone, and terrified. But I knew one thing. I had to get out of those woods. I had to escape. I started to walk, slowly at first, then faster, my eyes scanning the darkness, listening for any sound. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew that I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving. I had to survive. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in on me, the silence broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I imagined eyes watching me from the shadows, unseen predators stalking my every move. The image of the glowing eyes I'd seen in the woods haunted me. What were they? What kind of creature possessed such otherworldly luminescence? The man's fear had been palpable, his terror a mirror of my own. Whatever it was something he feared more than me. And that, in itself, was terrifying. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I stumbled upon a dirt road. It was the same road I'd driven in on, the one that led back to civilization. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me weak. I'd made it. I'd survived the night. But even as I started down the road, a sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the woods were still alive, still aware of my presence. I glanced back at the dense wall of trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. A dark shape, shifting and swirling, like smoke in the wind. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling remained, a cold knot of dread in the pit of my stomach. I reached the town just as the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty streets. I went straight to the police station, desperate to tell someone what had happened. The officer on duty, a young man with tired eyes, listened to my story with a mixture of skepticism and amusement. He took down my statement, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He chalked it up to the stress of being alone in the woods, suggesting I'd let my imagination run wild. I tried to explain about Michelle, about the man in the woods, about the creature with the glowing eyes. But the more I talked, the more unbelievable it sounded, even to me. The officer nodded politely, making notes, but his expression remained unchanged. He told me they'd send someone out to check on the cabin, but he made it clear that they didn't expect to find anything. I left the station feeling frustrated and defeated. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard, but no one believed me. I decided to drive back to the cabin myself, hoping to find some kind of proof, something to corroborate my story. I arrived in the late afternoon, the woods casting long, ominous shadows. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it. Everything was still, silent. I went inside, my heart pounding. I searched the cabin, looking for anything at all. But there was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone having been there. Even the photograph of Michelle and the man was gone. I went outside and walked over to Michelle's cabin. It looked even more dilapidated in the daylight, a skeletal frame against the backdrop of the trees. I hesitated before approaching, a sense of foreboding washing over me. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, just as it had been before. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay. I wandered through the cabin, my footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards. And then, I saw it. Tucked away in a dark corner, beneath a pile of rotting blankets, was a small, wooden box. I opened the box, my fingers trembling. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters. I picked up one of the letters and began to read. It was addressed to Michelle. The handwriting was old, shaky. The letter spoke of a dark secret, a family curse, a creature that had been bound to the woods for generations. It spoke of sacrifices, of rituals, of a bloodline tainted by evil. I read through the other letters, each one revealing a piece of the puzzle. Michelle wasn't just an old woman living in the woods. She was a guardian, a protector. She was trying to keep the creature contained, trying to prevent it from escaping. The man from the photograph, was her ancestor. He was the one who had made the pact with the creature, the one who had brought the curse upon their family. He was also the one I had seen in the woods, the one who had tried to attack me. And the creature was something ancient, something powerful, something beyond my comprehension. It was the thing that had been watching me, the thing that had driven the man to terror. I finally understood Michelle's warnings. Keep your lamps full, your windows closed, and your mind sharper than your axe. She wasn't just talking about protecting myself from the elements. She was talking about protecting myself from the darkness that lurked in the woods. I closed the box, my hand shaking. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to leave the woods behind. I had to escape the curse that had haunted this place for generations. I turned and fled the cabin, the secrets of the woods weighing heavily on my soul. I ran all the way back to my own cabin, grabbed my belongings, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the town, until I was far away from the woods, far away from the darkness. I never went back to the cabin. I never spoke of what I had seen. The woods held their secrets, and I knew it was best to leave them undisturbed. But the memory of that night, the image of the glowing eyes, the whispers in the dark, they would stay with me forever. A constant reminder of the evil that lurks just beyond the edge of our world, waiting for the unwary, waiting for the lost. The twin shadow. The snow fell softly, a gentle curtain of white against the dark canvas of the night. It was Christmas Eve, and my girlfriend, Catherine, and I were making our way back to my place after spending the afternoon with her family. The roads were mostly clear, a rare blessing for a winter night in upstate New York. The car hummed a comfortable tune, the tires whispering against the fresh snow. Inside, the air was warm and cozy, filled with the soft glow of the dashboard lights and the gentle scent of pine from the air freshener Catherine had insisted on. Catherine was humming along to a Christmas carol playing softly on the radio. She was gazing out the window, a small, contented smile playing on her lips. I reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Happy Christmas Eve," I said, the words a warm breath in the cool air. "Happy Christmas Eve to you too," she replied, turning to me with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow-covered trees lining the road like silent sentinels. Inside the car, though, it felt like we were in our own little world, a bubble of warmth and happiness against the winter chill. We talked about everything and nothing, the easy conversation flowing between us like a familiar melody. We discussed her family's chaotic but loving Christmas gathering, my own quiet plans for the holiday, and our shared excitement for the new year. The miles melted away, the rhythm of the road a soothing lullaby. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty, just the falling snow and the twin red taillights fading into the distance. About an hour into the drive, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me hesitate. It could be Catherine's mom calling with a last-minute Christmas wish. I pressed the button to answer. "Hello?" I said. The voice on the other end was low, raspy, and unsettling. It was a man's voice, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. "Is this Michael?" the voice asked. "Yes, speaking," I replied, a knot beginning to tighten in my stomach. "Michael," the voice repeated, the word hanging in the air like a chilling breath. "I know you. I know where you live. I know everything about you." My heart started to pound in my chest. I glanced at Catherine. She was still looking out the window, seemingly oblivious to the call. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The voice chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "That's not important right now, Michael. What's important is Catherine." My blood ran cold. "What about Catherine?" I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm not here for you, Michael," the voice said, the words dripping with menace. "I'm here for Catherine." A wave of fear washed over me, cold and clammy. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it just laughed again, that same dry, rasping chuckle that sent chills down my spine. Then, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my mind reeling. Who was that? How did he know me? How did he know Catherine? And what did he want with her? I looked over at Catherine. She was still gazing out the window, her expression unchanged. I wanted to tell her about the call, but I hesitated. I didn't want to scare her, not on Christmas Eve. I decided to play it cool, at least for now. I put my phone back in my pocket and tried to focus on the road. But the voice, the laughter, the chilling words, they kept echoing in my mind. The serenity of the drive had been shattered, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The snow continued to fall, but now it seemed less like a gentle blessing and more like a shroud, covering something sinister. The rest of the drive was a blur. I tried to maintain a casual conversation with Catherine, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. Every few minutes, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights bearing down on us, a dark figure lurking in the snowy shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the falling snow. Catherine seemed oblivious to my distress. She chatted about her plans for Christmas Day, her voice light and cheerful. I forced myself to smile and nod, pretending to listen, but all I could think about was the phone call. "I'm not here for you, Michael. I'm here for Catherine." The words echoed in my head, a chilling mantra. We finally arrived at my apartment. It was a small, cozy place on the outskirts of town. I parked the car and we went inside, the warmth a welcome contrast to the cold outside. Catherine went straight to the kitchen to make some hot chocolate, while I stood in the living room, staring out the window at the falling snow. I pulled out my phone and checked the call log. The number was still listed as unknown. I tried calling it back, but it went straight to voicemail. Just a generic, automated message. I felt a surge of frustration. Who was this person? What did they want? And why Catherine? Catherine came into the living room with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah, just a weird call," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Wrong number, I think." "Oh," she said, her expression relaxing. "That's happened to me before." We sat on the couch, sipping our hot chocolate in comfortable silence. But even in the warmth of my apartment, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The phone call had cast a dark shadow over the evening, tainting the festive spirit. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I decided to tell Catherine about the call. I figured it was better to be honest with her, even if it meant scaring her a little. "Catherine," I said, "something weird happened on the drive tonight." I told her about the phone call, about the man's voice, about the chilling words. "I'm not here for you, Michael. I'm here for Catherine." As I spoke, I watched her face. Her eyes widened with fear, and her breath hitched in her throat. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Who was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said. "The number was unknown." She was quiet for a moment, then she suddenly turned away, as if she was trying to hide something. A shiver went down my spine. "Catherine, is there something you're not telling me?" I asked, my voice tight. "No," she said quickly, perhaps a bit too quickly. "It's nothing." "It doesn't sound like nothing," I pressed. "That call, it was about you." She hesitated, then she said, "It's just, there's this guy. He was obsessed with me." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, obsessed?" He wouldn't leave me alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He kept calling me, texting me, even showing up at my house. It was really scary. Why didn't you tell me about this before?" I asked, my voice laced with hurt and anger. "I didn't want to worry you," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought he was gone. I haven't heard from him in months." "And you think he might be the one who called tonight?" I asked. She nodded slowly. A wave of anger washed over me. How could she have kept this from me? How could she have put us in danger? But beneath the anger, there was something else, a gnawing suspicion. Something about her story didn't quite add up. Why had she turned away when I told her about the call? Why had she been so reluctant to talk about this obsessed guy? I looked at her, really looked at her, and a chilling thought crept into my mind. What if she wasn't telling me the whole truth? What if she knew more about this than she was letting on? The thought made my stomach churn. I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The unease settled over me like a shroud. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were haunted by the raspy voice and the chilling words, "I'm here for Catherine." I woke up Christmas morning with a heavy heart, the festive cheer replaced by a gnawing dread. Catherine, however, seemed to have regained some of her composure. She was bright and cheerful, bustling around the apartment, preparing breakfast and humming Christmas carols. Her forced cheerfulness only amplified my suspicions. I tried to shake off my paranoia, telling myself I was overreacting. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. I watched Catherine, scrutinizing her every move, searching for any telltale sign of deception. Her cheerfulness, her eagerness to celebrate, all felt staged. We opened presents, a hollow ritual. Catherine showered me with gifts, her smiles wide and seemingly genuine. I accepted them, but my heart wasn't in it. The beautiful sweater she knitted for me felt like a lead weight in my hands. All I could think about was the phone call, the unknown caller, and Catherine's evasiveness. Later in the day, we decided to go for a walk in the snow. The crisp winter air and the picturesque landscape did little to soothe my troubled mind. As we walked, I tried to steer the conversation back to the previous night, to the phone call, to the obsessed ex-boyfriend. "So," I said casually, "this guy, the one who was bothering you, did you ever report him to the police?" Catherine hesitated for a moment, then said, "No, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I thought he would just go away." "But he didn't," I pointed out. "He called last night." "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Michael." She reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. Her touch, once a source of comfort, now felt unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing me, that her fear was an act. "Catherine," I said, stopping and turning to face her, "you need to be honest with me. There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Her eyes flickered away, and she remained silent. "Who was that on the phone last night?" I pressed. Was it really this ex-boyfriend? She finally met my gaze, her eyes filled with tears. "It was him," she whispered. "His name is David. And what does he want?" I asked, my voice tight. He wants me back," she said, her voice trembling. He's obsessed with me. "And you didn't think it was important to tell me about this?" I asked, my voice rising in anger. "You kept this from me, Catherine. You put us both in danger." "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I exclaimed. "You're lying to me, Catherine. I can feel it. There's something more to this, isn't there?" She looked away again, her face pale. She didn't answer. My heart sank. I knew I was right. She was hiding something. But what? What could be so terrible that she couldn't tell me? The walk back to the apartment was silent and tense. The festive spirit had completely evaporated, replaced by a thick cloud of suspicion and distrust. I felt like I was living with a stranger, a woman I thought I knew, but who was now revealed to be a master of deception. Back in the apartment, the silence was deafening. I couldn't bear to be near her. I went into the living room and stared out the window at the falling snow, my mind racing. I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. I decided to call the police. I explained the situation to the officer on the other end of the line, telling him about the phone call, about Catherine's obsessed ex-boyfriend, about my suspicions. The officer took my information and told me they would look into it. As I hung up the phone, I glanced at Catherine. She was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. I watched her for a moment, my heart aching. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust her, but the voice on the phone, the chilling words, the lies, they all pointed to something darker, something more sinister. I knew, deep down, that the truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The police officer's words echoed in my mind. "We'll look into it, sir, but these things can take time." Time. I didn't have time. The voice on the phone, the feeling of being watched, the lies, they created a suffocating sense of urgency. I felt like Catherine was slipping away from me, becoming a stranger shrouded in secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger, that we were both in danger. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to know the truth, and I needed to know it now. I started by searching online for any information about Catherine's obsessed ex-boyfriend, David. I found nothing. No police records, no social media presence, nothing. It was as if he didn't exist. This only deepened my suspicions. I then turned my attention to Catherine. I subtly started asking her questions about her past, about her life before she met me. She was evasive, her answers vague and contradictory. She claimed she had moved around a lot, that she had few close friends. But her stories didn't add up. There were gaps, inconsistencies, things that just didn't make sense. One evening, while Catherine was in the shower, I decided to look through her things. I know it was a breach of privacy, but I was desperate. I started with her purse. I found nothing of significance, just the usual things: wallet, keys, makeup. Then I checked her backpack. Inside, I found a small, locked box. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew this box held the answers I was looking for. I tried to open it, but it was securely locked. I considered forcing it open, but I hesitated. What if Catherine came out of the shower? What if she caught me? I decided to wait. I put the box back in the backpack and pretended to watch TV until Catherine came out of the shower. She seemed relaxed, unaware of my discovery. She sat next to me on the couch, and we watched the rest of the movie in silence. But my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of the locked box. Later that night, after Catherine had fallen asleep, I quietly got out of bed and retrieved the box from her backpack. I took it into the living room and sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling. I knew that what I was about to do was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know the truth. I found a small screwdriver in the kitchen drawer and carefully used it to pry open the lock. The box creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside, I found a stack of old photographs, a small diary, and a single key. I picked up the photographs. They were pictures of Catherine, but she looked different, younger, more carefree. In some of the photos, she was with a man, not David, another man. They looked happy, in love. Who was he? I then opened the diary. The handwriting was Catherine's. I was sure of it. I started to read. The diary entries chronicled a tumultuous relationship filled with passion, jealousy, and violence. The man in the photos was her boyfriend, Michael. My name. As I read, a chilling realization dawned on me. Catherine hadn't been entirely truthful about her past. She had omitted a crucial detail, a dark secret that she had kept hidden from me. She had been in a relationship with a man named Michael before, and it had ended badly. Very badly. The diary entries hinted at abuse, threats, and a desperate attempt to escape. The last entry was chilling. I have to get away from him. He's going to kill me. My blood ran cold. I looked at the photographs again, at the happy couple, at the man named Michael. He looked familiar. Too familiar. It was me. Or rather, it was a man who looked exactly like me. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Who was Catherine? Who was I? What was going on? I picked up the key that was in the box. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I knew I had to find out. I had to uncover the rest of the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I had to confront Catherine, but as I turned to go back to the bedroom, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw Catherine standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with terror. She was holding a knife. The sight of Catherine standing in the doorway, knife in hand, froze me to the bone. The diary, the photographs, the key, they all swirled in my mind, creating a vortex of fear and confusion. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. Catherine? I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on me, her expression a mixture of fear and rage. The knife trembled in her hand, the blade glinting in the dim light. What is this? I asked, gesturing towards the knife. She remained silent, her gaze unwavering. I took a step back, my mind racing. Was she going to attack me? Was she the one who had been calling me? Was she the one who was in danger? Catherine, please. I said, my voice shaking. Tell me what's going on. She finally spoke, her voice low and raspy, almost unrecognizable. You know, Michael, she said. You know what's going on. My blood ran cold. How did she know about the diary? How did she know about the photographs? How did she know about him? I don't understand, I stammered. She laughed, a dry, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. You understand perfectly, she said. You've always understood. She took a step closer to me, the knife still held high. You can't hide from him, Michael, she said. He's always watching. He's always waiting. Who? I asked, my voice trembling. Who are you talking about? You, she said, her eyes burning into mine. You're the one he's waiting for. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, a terrifying dream from which I couldn't wake up. I looked at Catherine, at her face, at her eyes, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw myself. Not literally, of course, but there was something in her eyes, something in her expression that mirrored my own fear, my own confusion, my own sense of dread. It was as if I was looking into a mirror, a dark, twisted mirror that reflected my deepest, darkest fears. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He's you, Michael, she said. He's the part of you that you've been trying to hide from, the part of you that you're afraid of. I don't believe you, I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. Deep down, I knew that she was right. There was a part of me, a dark, hidden part that I had been running from for years, a part that I had tried to forget, but that had never forgotten me. Catherine took another step closer, the knife now just inches from my chest. It's time to face him, Michael, she said. It's time to face yourself. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the pain, but the pain never came. Instead, I heard a sound, a soft click, and then nothing. I opened my eyes and saw Catherine standing there, the knife still in her hand, but her gaze was no longer fixed on me. She was looking past me, at something behind me. I turned around and saw myself. Standing in the doorway behind me was a man who looked exactly like me. The same face, the same build, the same clothes. But there was something different about him. Something darker, something more sinister. His eyes were cold and empty, his expression a mask of pure evil. Hello, Michael, he said, his voice a chilling echo of my own. It's time we met. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Was this real? Was I hallucinating? Was this some kind of twisted joke? Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. I'm you, he said. The you that you've been trying to hide from. The you that you're afraid of. I don't understand, I stammered. You will, he said, taking a step closer to me. You will. He raised his hand, and I flinched, expecting him to strike me. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out and touched my face, his fingers cold and clammy. It's time to come home, Michael, he whispered. And then, everything went black. I awoke to a chilling silence. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. Panic clawed at my throat. Where was I? What had happened? The last thing I remembered was him, my doppelganger, his cold touch, his chilling words. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. I strained against the unseen restraints, but it was no use. I was trapped in the darkness, trapped in my own fear. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a sliver of light pierced the darkness. It grew, expanding, revealing my surroundings. I was in a room, a small, bare room. The walls were concrete, the floor cold and damp. There was no window, no door, just a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. I was lying on a cot, my wrists and ankles bound with thick ropes. My heart pounded in my chest. I was a prisoner. I sat up, my body aching, my mind reeling. Where was Catherine? What had she done? Was she in on this? Had she been working with him? The questions swirled in my mind, creating a vortex of confusion and dread. I tried to piece together the events of the night, but my memory was fragmented, like shards of broken glass. I remembered the phone call, the diary, the photographs, the confrontation with Catherine, the appearance of my doppelganger, and then nothing, just darkness. I looked around the room, searching for any clue, any sign of escape. But there was nothing, just the bare walls, the cold floor, the single light bulb. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was trapped, alone, at the mercy of whatever was out there. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft, scraping sound, coming from somewhere outside the room. My breath hitched in my throat. I strained to listen, my senses on high alert. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the other side of the wall. Then, I heard a voice, a low, raspy voice. It was him. "Are you awake, Michael?" he said. My blood ran cold. He knew I was awake. He was watching me. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice trembling. He chuckled, a dry, chilling sound. "You're home, Michael," he said. "You're finally home. What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want what's rightfully mine," he said. "I want you." "You're insane," I said. "You're not me." "Oh, but I am you," he said. "I'm the you that you've been trying to deny, the you that you're afraid of." "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice betrayed my fear. "You will be," he said. "You will be." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Catherine sends her regards." My heart sank. So, she was in on it. She had betrayed me. "What have you done with her?" I asked. "She's where she belongs," he said. "With me." "You're both insane," I said. He laughed again, that same dry, chilling chuckle. "We're not insane, Michael," he said. "We're just ourselves." The scraping sound grew louder, closer. I could feel him on the other side of the wall, his presence a palpable force. "It's time, Michael," he said. "It's time to become one." The wall began to crack, the concrete crumbling under some unseen force. I watched in horror as a hole appeared in the wall, growing larger, larger, until it was big enough for him to step through. He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on me, his expression a mask of pure evil. "Hello, Michael," he said. "It's time to come home." He reached out his hand, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my life was about to change forever. Or perhaps it was about to end. I didn't know. All I knew was that I was facing my worst nightmare, a nightmare that was me. The figure standing before me was a mirror image, a perfect replica. Yet, the reflection stared back with a chilling emptiness, a void where my own humanity should have resided. His hand, outstretched, beckoned me towards an abyss I knew I couldn't escape. Resistance felt futile, like struggling against a current that was both within me and beyond my control. "Come home, Michael," he repeated, the words resonating with a sinister familiarity. It wasn't just his voice. It was the feeling behind the words, a pull that tugged at something deep within my soul, a place I had buried and desperately tried to forget. I remained frozen, a prisoner of my own terror. My mind screamed at me to fight, to run, to do anything but succumb. But my body betrayed me, locked in a paralysis born of fear and a strange sense of recognition. He took another step closer, closing the distance between us. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a tension that made my skin crawl. His eyes, identical to mine, held a depth of malice that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. I couldn't look away. "You know you want this," he whispered, his voice a seductive murmur. "You know you belong here." He was right. A part of me did want this. A dark, twisted part that craved the power, the freedom, the utter lack of conscience that he embodied. It was the part of me I had fought so hard to suppress, the part one had convinced myself didn't exist. But he was real. He was me. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. The touch was cold, yet it ignited a fire within me, a fire that had been smoldering for years, waiting for its moment to erupt. "Don't fight it, Michael," he said. "Let it consume you." His words were a key, unlocking the cage that had held my dark self captive for so long. The walls crumbled, the bars dissolved, and the beast within roared to life. I felt a surge of power, a rush of adrenaline, a chilling sense of liberation. I looked at him, at myself, and a slow smile spread across my face. It was a smile that mirrored his, a smile that reflected the darkness that now consumed me. "I'm not afraid anymore," I said, my voice echoing his, my voice becoming his. He chuckled, a sound that resonated deep within my bones. "I know," he said. He reached out his other hand, and I took it. Our fingers intertwined, our hands merged, our bodies became one. The transformation was complete. I was him, and he was me. We were one. The room dissolved, the walls vanished, and we were standing in a vast, empty space. There was no light, no darkness, just an infinite expanse of nothingness. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice now a perfect echo of his. "We are where we belong," he said. "We are home." He turned to me, his eyes burning into mine. "Now," he said, "we can begin." And as I looked into his eyes, into my own eyes, I knew that the nightmare had just begun. The transformation was complete, but the terror was far from over. It had just shifted, from the fear of him to the fear of what we had become. The fear of the darkness that now resided within me, a darkness that I knew would never let me go. The fear of myself. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand illuminated Catherine's sleeping form beside me. She was curled on her side, her breathing soft and even. Relief washed over me, a wave so intense it almost made me weak. It was just a dream, a terrible, vivid, horrifying dream. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of fear that clung to my mind. The dream had felt so real. The voice, the room, the him, the image of my doppelganger, his eyes filled with malice, his touch cold and clammy, was seared into my memory. I turned to Catherine, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, innocent. But even in the darkness, even in the safety of my own bedroom, a seed of doubt had been planted. The dream had shown me a part of myself I didn't know existed, a darkness that lurked beneath the surface. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting to be unleashed. I reached out and gently touched her arm. She stirred slightly, then turned and snuggled closer to me, her head resting on my chest. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. But even as I held her, even as I felt the reassuring rhythm of her heartbeat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The dream had opened a door to a place I had never wanted to visit. And now, I couldn't close it. The darkness was still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for its moment to return. I knew I would never look at Catherine or at myself in the same way again. The dream had shown me the truth, or at least a truth, and that truth was terrifying. It was the truth that I was capable of anything, that the darkness within me was real. I lay there, holding Catherine close, listening to her breathe, and I knew that the nightmare wasn't over. It had just changed shape. It had moved from the realm of dreams to the realm of reality. It was now a part of me, a shadow that would forever follow me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay within. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never truly be free of it. The dream was over, but the fear was just beginning. The edge of the woods. It started subtly, as most unsettling things do. My fiancée, Sarah, and I had bought a small house on the edge of town, a little further out than we'd originally planned. The selling point was the big, beautiful woods that bordered our backyard. We both loved the idea of having nature right outside our door. We envisioned cozy winter nights by the fire, watching the snow fall on the trees. What we didn't envision was the creeping sense of dread that began to settle in with the first snowfall. It was January, and the woods were a silent, snow-covered expanse. One morning, Sarah noticed something odd near the back porch. "Look," she said, pointing to the fresh snow. "Footprints. I want to take a look." Sure enough, there were a series of footprints leading from the edge of the woods to just a few feet from our porch. They were large, clearly human, but what struck me as strange was that they were barefoot. In the snow, it had been bitterly cold for weeks, the kind of cold that bites at your exposed skin and makes you shiver down to your bones. Who would be walking around barefoot in this weather? "Maybe it was an animal," I suggested, trying to dismiss the unease that was already starting to form in my gut. Sarah frowned. "They look like human footprints to me, and they're too big for an animal." We shrugged it off, attributing it to some oddity of nature or a neighbor playing a strange prank. We joked about it being a yeti or some crazy hermit living in the woods, but the image of those bare footprints in the snow lingered in my mind. A few days later, the footprints appeared again. This time, they were closer to the house, circling the porch and even going right up to the windows. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't a joke anymore. The feeling of unease had intensified, replaced by something akin to fear. We started being more careful. We made sure all the doors and windows were locked at night. I even bought a motion sensor light for the backyard. We told ourselves we were being overly cautious, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The way the footprints seemed to appear and disappear without a trace, the fact that they were barefoot, it all felt wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath and listened. The tapping continued, soft but insistent. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on the nightstand and turned it on. I peered cautiously through the blinds. Nothing. I scanned the backyard, the beam of the lamp cutting through the darkness. Still nothing. I let out a sigh of relief, telling myself it was just the wind or a branch hitting the window. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like eyes were boring into me from the darkness. Sleep evaded me for the rest of the night. The next morning, the footprints were back. They were everywhere. They crisscrossed the yard, circled the house, and even went right up to the front door. It looked like someone had been walking around our house all night, but there were no other tracks, no signs of anyone coming or going. It was as if the person had simply materialized out of thin air. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. This was no longer just strange or unsettling. This was terrifying. I called Theo, a friend of mine who lived nearby. He was always the rational one, the guy who could find a logical explanation for anything. I told him about the footprints, about the tapping on the window, about the feeling of being watched. He listened patiently, then suggested we go for a walk in the woods. He thought maybe we could find some clues, some explanation for what was happening. Reluctantly, I agreed. I grabbed my coat and followed Theo out into the snow-covered woods. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunching of our boots on the snow. We followed the footprints, which led us deeper and deeper into the woods. They were becoming more erratic now, weaving between the trees, sometimes disappearing altogether and then reappearing a few feet away. After about an hour of tracking, we came to a small clearing, and that's when we saw them. The clearing was a small, circular space surrounded by a thick wall of trees. The snow was undisturbed there, except for the intricate pattern of the barefoot prints that led us to it. In the center of the clearing, we saw them. For figures, naked, in the snow. Even from a distance, the sight was profoundly disturbing. The cold was biting. I was bundled in layers of winter gear, and I could feel the chill seeping into my bones. How could anyone be naked in this weather? They didn't seem to notice the cold, though. They were completely still, almost like statues. Two of the figures were larger, presumably adults. The other two were smaller, and they seemed to be attached to trees. It wasn't clear at first what I was seeing. The smaller figures were pressed against the trunks, their limbs wrapped around the bark. As we got closer, the horror of the situation became clearer. They weren't just clinging to the trees. They were eating something. Something red. It was smeared on their faces and hands, and it was glistening in the dim light filtering through the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but the implication was sickening. The larger figures stood nearby, seemingly watching. They didn't react to our presence. They didn't move. They just stood there, their unblinking eyes fixed on something. I couldn't tell what. Their faces were obscured by shadows and the low light, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unsettling. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to turn away, to run back to the safety of our warm house, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Theo was equally stunned. He stood beside me, his mouth agape, his face pale. We didn't speak. We couldn't speak. After what felt like an eternity, Theo finally managed to whisper, "We need to get out of here." I nodded, my legs finally finding the strength to move. We turned and fled, retracing our steps through the woods, the image of those naked figures seared into our minds. We didn't stop running until we reached my back porch, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. We went inside, locked the door, and immediately called the police. We told them what we had seen, about the footprints, about the figures in the woods. The officer on the other end of the line sounded skeptical, but he took our report. He said they would send someone out to investigate. A few hours later, a police officer came to our house. He listened to our story, asked us a few questions, and then went to check the woods. He came back a short time later, shaking his head. "We didn't find anything," he said. "No footprints, no sign of anyone being there. It's like you said, they just disappeared." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. It was as if we had imagined the whole thing, but we hadn't. We both saw them. We both knew what we had seen. The officer shrugged, told us to call again if we saw anything else, and then left. We were alone. The feeling of unease had returned, stronger than ever. We knew something was terribly wrong. We knew we couldn't stay in that house any longer. That night, we packed a bag and went to stay at a hotel. We couldn't bring ourselves to go back to the house, not yet. The next day, we went back to the police station. We asked if they had found anything, any leads, anything at all. They told us they were still investigating, but they didn't have any new information. We pressed them, told them about the way the figures were just standing there, naked in the snow, about the smaller figures eating something, red, but they just looked at us with a mixture of pity and disbelief. We left the police station feeling defeated and helpless. We didn't know what to do. We felt like no one believed us, like we were going crazy. We went back to the hotel, and we sat there, staring at each other, trying to make sense of what we had seen. We talked about moving, about leaving town altogether, but even that didn't feel like it would be enough. The image of those figures was burned into our brains. We knew we would never forget what we had seen in the clearing. We knew that something was out there, in the woods, something unnatural, and we knew that it was only a matter of time before it came back. We stayed in the hotel for a few days, trying to process what had happened. We barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the clearing and the figures in the snow. The police hadn't called back, and we knew they weren't going to. We were on our own. Finally, we decided we had to go back to the house. We couldn't afford to stay in a hotel indefinitely, and we couldn't just abandon our home. We went back during the day, armed with a sense of dread and a heavy dose of paranoia. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent shivers down our spines. The house seemed normal. There were no signs of anything amiss. The footprints were gone, washed away by a light snowfall. It was as if nothing had ever happened, but we knew better. We knew that something was lurking in the woods, something that defied explanation. We tried to settle back into our routine, but it was impossible. We were constantly on edge, listening for any strange noises, watching the woods with a sense of foreboding. We installed more motion sensor lights, we bought a security system, we even considered getting a dog, but nothing felt like it would be enough. One night, I woke up to a sound, a soft scratching at the window. My heart leaped into my throat. I nudged Sarah awake, and we both listened, holding our breath. The scratching continued, rhythmic and insistent. It sounded like fingernails scraping against the glass. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window. I peeked through the blinds. Nothing. I scanned the backyard, the motion sensor lights illuminating the snow-covered ground. Still nothing. But the scratching continued, seemingly coming from right outside the window. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the nightstand, ready to defend myself. Sarah was behind me, her eyes wide with fear. We stood there, frozen, listening to the scratching, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. We stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting, but there was nothing, just the silence of the winter night. We didn't sleep a wink that night. We sat on the couch, huddled together, watching the windows, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The night passed without incident. The next morning, we checked the window. There were no scratches, no marks of any kind. It was as if the scratching had never happened. But we knew it had. We had both heard it. The fear was growing, consuming us. We felt like we were losing our minds. We started to argue, blaming each other for what was happening. We were both terrified, and we didn't know how to cope. Then, a few days later, something else happened. We came home from work to find the front door wide open. We cautiously entered the house, calling out, but there was no answer. Everything inside seemed to be in its place. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. It was as if someone had been in the house, watching us, waiting for us. We called the police again, but they were dismissive. They told us it was probably just the wind, or maybe we had forgotten to close the door properly. We knew they didn't believe us. We knew we were on our own. We felt trapped, helpless. We didn't know what to do. We were living in a constant state of fear, waiting for something terrible to happen. We knew that whatever was out there, in the woods, it wasn't going to leave us alone. It was only a matter of time before it came back. And this time, we weren't sure if we would survive. The open door incident was the breaking point. We couldn't continue living in fear, constantly anticipating the next intrusion. We needed answers, however unsettling they might be. We had to understand what was happening, what presence was lurking in the woods. Our research intensified. We delved deeper into local archives, seeking any record of unusual occurrences. We discovered whispers, fragmented tales passed down through generations, of a group of people living wild in the dense forests, isolated from the outside world. They were said to be descendants of early settlers who had retreated into the wilderness long ago, choosing a life apart from civilization. These stories painted them as feral, almost mythical beings, rarely seen but always present, a hidden current of unease beneath the surface of everyday life. Armed with these fragmented narratives, we returned to the woods. This time, we were more cautious, more deliberate. We followed the path to the clearing, the familiar dread tightening in our stomachs with each step. The clearing was empty, as before, but this time, we knew what to look for. We examined the ground meticulously. Beyond the faint tracks we'd seen before, we found other signs, small, almost imperceptible details. Scraps of animal hide, crudely tanned. The remains of a fire, long cold. Marks on trees, not from animals, but deliberate carvings. These weren't the signs of a supernatural entity. They were the signs of people. The realization was both terrifying and strangely logical. It explained the footprints, the strange behavior, the sense of being watched. It wasn't a monster in the woods, but something perhaps even more disturbing. A group of people living outside the bounds of society, with customs and practices we could barely comprehend. We followed the faint trail, now understanding it not as a drag mark, but as a path used by those who knew the woods intimately. It led us deeper into the wilderness, to a hidden ravine, and there we saw them. They were huddled around a fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were human, but different. Their clothes were made of rough hides and furs. Their hair was long and matted. Their eyes, when they turned towards us, held a strange mixture of curiosity and hostility. We didn't approach. We watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows. We observed their movements, their interactions. They moved with a quiet efficiency, a primal grace. They seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the forest, a part of it, as much as the trees and the animals. What we saw was unsettling. Their behavior was primitive. They ate raw meat, tearing it apart with their hands. They spoke in a language we didn't understand, a series of clicks and guttural sounds. They performed rituals around the fire, their movements rhythmic and hypnotic. But the most disturbing thing was their eyes. They were vacant, almost lifeless. They didn't seem to possess the same spark of humanity that we did. They were like animals, driven by instinct, existing solely in the present moment. We watched for hours, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. And then, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, they disappeared. They melted back into the forest, leaving no trace of their presence. We retreated, shaken and disturbed. We had found our answer, but it was far more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. It wasn't a supernatural force we were dealing with, but a group of people living outside the boundaries of our world, with customs and practices that were alien and unsettling. We returned to our lives, but the haunting persisted. The knowledge of their existence, the memory of their vacant eyes, lingered in the back of our minds. We knew they were still out there, in the woods, living their hidden lives. And we knew that they could return at any moment, bringing with them the chilling reminder of the wildness that still existed, just beyond the edge of our civilized world. Whispers in the pines. The biting wind whipped through the towering pines, a constant, mournful sigh that seemed to echo the unsettling feeling in my gut. We were deep in the Uhori National Forest, North Carolina, a good 2 hours from civilization. Just me, my 2 co-workers, Mark and Dave, and miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness. We were contracted to clear a section of old-growth timber, a job that was as physically demanding as it was isolating. I'd been doing this for 5 years, and while I was used to the solitude, this place felt different. There was an oppressive silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather heavy, like the air before a storm. Our camp was basic, a clearing just big enough for our small camper, a fire pit, and a few felled logs for seating. We worked long hours, the rhythmic roar of the chainsaws our constant companion. Evenings were spent cooking simple meals, sharing stories, and trying to drown out the wind with the crackling fire. We had a small generator for lights and a radio for company. That radio, though, was where things started to get weird. It began subtly, static, mostly. We were used to that in the deep woods. But then, amidst the static, we started hearing voices. Not clear conversations, but whispers. Faint, distorted murmurs that seemed to weave in and out of the static, just on the edge of comprehension. At first, we dismissed it. Radio interference, we figured. The forest playing tricks on our ears. But it kept happening. Every time we turned on the radio, those whispers were there, lurking beneath the static like unseen presences. One evening, Dave, the youngest of our crew, was fiddling with the dial, trying to find a clear station. He stopped suddenly, his hand frozen on the tuner. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. Mark and I exchanged a look. "Hear what, Dave?" Mark asked, chuckling. "You finally found a ghost station?" Dave shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, man. It was a voice. It said my name." We both scoffed. "Come on, Dave," I said. It was just static. "No, I swear," he insisted. "It said Dave." Clear as day. We tried to brush it off, but a seed of unease had been planted. Over the next few days, the whispers intensified. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They sounded like they were trying to form words, sentences. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but the intent was clear. They were trying to communicate, and it wasn't friendly. We tried changing frequencies, switching to different bands, even trying a different radio altogether. But it was no use. The whispers followed us, a constant, unsettling presence. It was like the radio was haunted, a portal to something else. The isolation of the forest, the long hours, the constant drone of the chainsaws, the whispers on the radio. It was all starting to get to us. We were on edge, jumpy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent our hearts racing. We started seeing things in the shadows, shapes that flickered at the periphery of our vision. We were losing sleep, our nerves frayed. One morning, we found something that made our blood run cold. Near the edge of our clearing, we discovered footprints. Not the heavy tread of work boots, but smaller, lighter prints. They weren't animal tracks either. They looked like human footprints. Small human footprints. "Kids," Mark muttered, his face pale. "Probably just some kids hiking." But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way the prints were spaced, the direction they were going. They weren't the playful wanderings of children. They were deliberate, purposeful, and they were heading deeper into the woods, away from any established trails. That night, the whispers on the radio were louder than ever. They seemed to be mocking us, taunting us. And then, we heard something else. A faint, high-pitched giggle. It sent shivers down my spine. It sounded like a child. We extinguished the fire and huddled inside the camper, the silence broken only by the wind and the whispers on the radio. We were trapped, miles from civilization, with something or someone out there in the dark. And we had no idea what it wanted. The next morning, the unease hung heavy in the air, thicker than the morning mist. We tried to shake off our fear, telling ourselves we were being paranoid. But the image of those small footprints, the whispers, the chilling giggle, they were etched into our minds. We decided we had to do something. We couldn't just stay there, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. "We need to find out what's going on," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Those footprints, they have to lead somewhere." Mark and Dave reluctantly agreed. We packed some food, water, and a first aid kit, and armed ourselves with our axes, more for protection than for work. We followed the tracks, deeper and deeper into the woods. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent watchers. The air was still, the only sound our own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. After a couple of hours, we came to a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated hut. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood weathered and gray, the roof sagging. An ominous feeling washed over me. This was it. This was where the footprints led. We approached cautiously, our senses on high alert. The hut was silent, no sign of life. We tried the door, but it was locked. Mark forced it open with his axe, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the hut was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something foul. We stepped inside, our eyes adjusting to the dim light. What we saw made our blood run cold. The hut was a mess. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out, clothes scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had ransacked the place. And then we saw the drawings. They were on the walls, crudely drawn in what looked like crayon. Disturbing images of stick figures, some with exaggerated features, others engaged in violent acts. There were also symbols, strange and unfamiliar, that sent a shiver down my spine. But the worst was yet to come. In a corner of the room, we found a pile of clothes. They were children's clothes. Underwear, t-shirts, shorts, all small, clearly belonging to a child. And mixed in with the clothes, we found rolls of duct tape. Several of them. A wave of nausea washed over me. The implications were clear. This wasn't just a random hut. This was a place of something evil, something unspeakable. We didn't stay long. We backed out of the hut, our faces pale, our hearts pounding. We had found what we were looking for, but we wished we hadn't. We knew we had to get out of there. We had to get back to civilization, back to safety. We ran, not stopping until we reached our camp. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, our hands shaking. We didn't even bother to put out the fire properly. We just wanted to get away from that place, as far away as possible. As we drove out of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, chasing us. But there was nothing, just the endless trees, receding into the distance. We made it back to town, shaken and traumatized. We went to the police, told them what we had found. They took our statements, but I could tell they didn't believe us. They chalked it up to our imaginations, the stress of working in the woods. But we knew what we had seen. We knew what was out there, and we knew that we would never be the same. The whispers in the woods had awakened something inside us, a primal fear that would forever haunt our dreams. Trail of Terror, the Pacific Crest Trail. Just the name conjured images of serene landscapes, towering pines, and the quiet solitude I craved. I'd been planning this solo hike for months, a chance to escape the city's cacophony and reconnect with myself. I wasn't a seasoned hiker, but I was in decent shape, had done my research, and felt confident in my preparations. My backpack was loaded with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food for several days, a water filter, and a first aid kit. I even packed a small, lightweight .22 pistol, mostly for peace of mind against wildlife, though I hoped I'd never have to use it. The first few days were bliss. The trail wound its way through breathtaking scenery. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, dappling the forest floor. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I hiked at a steady pace, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional glimpse of a deer or a soaring hawk. Evenings were spent setting up camp, cooking a simple meal, and watching the stars emerge, a vast, glittering tapestry spread across the night sky. The silence, broken only by the crackling of my campfire and the rustling of leaves, was a welcome change from the constant hum of urban life. It was on the fourth day that I noticed something off. I stopped for a water break, setting my pack down by a large, gnarled tree. When I reached for my water bottle, I noticed the small pouch containing my trail mix was missing. I distinctly remembered packing it that morning. I searched my pack thoroughly, but it was nowhere to be found. I shrugged it off, assuming I'd simply misplaced it. Maybe a squirrel had snatched it while I wasn't looking. It was a little unsettling, but I tried not to dwell on it. The next day, it happened again. I had hung my food bag from a branch, a precaution against bears and other critters. In the morning, I found the bag still hanging, but the small, resealable container of dried fruit I'd packed was gone. This was getting strange. 2 items missing in 2 days? It was starting to feel less like a coincidence and more like something else. I began to feel a prickle of unease. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of color that didn't belong. I listened intently to the sounds of the forest, trying to discern any unusual noises. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness, unseen, but present. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant, nagging presence in the back of my mind. The following day, the feeling intensified. I noticed small things out of place. A rock that I was sure hadn't been there before. A branch that seemed to have been recently broken. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, even though I hadn't had a fire that morning. These little things, insignificant on their own, combined to create a growing sense of dread. It was like a puzzle, with each missing piece adding to a picture I didn't want to see. I started to imagine things. I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. I'd hear a faint whisper on the wind, a sound that seemed to call my name, but was probably just the rustling leaves. My mind was playing tricks on me, exaggerating every sound, every shadow. The solitude I had initially craved was now becoming a source of torment. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, filled with unseen presences and imagined threats. I was starting to unravel. The next morning, I woke with a start. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd had a terrible dream. I couldn't remember the specifics, but it had left me with a lingering sense of unease. I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to get moving. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was causing this feeling of dread. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. But there was never anything there, just the endless expanse of the forest, silent and still. The missing items continued to be a source of worry. Another small bag of nuts disappeared from my pack. It was as if someone was deliberately taking things, playing some kind of twisted game with me. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Who was doing this? And why? My mind began to race, conjuring up all sorts of scenarios. Was it a wild animal, perhaps a raccoon or a fox, that had learned how to open my pack? Or was it something worse? I thought about the stories I'd heard about hermits and outcasts living deep in the woods, people who had abandoned civilization and embraced a feral existence. Could one of them be following me? The thought was terrifying. I imagined a wild-looking figure, covered in dirt and leaves, with matted hair and piercing eyes, silently stalking me through the trees. The image was so vivid, so real, that I almost convinced myself I had seen it. As the day wore on, my paranoia grew. I started to see things that weren't there. A twisted branch would look like a human figure. A patch of sunlight filtering through the leaves would resemble a pair of eyes. My senses were heightened, but they were also deceiving me. I was losing my grip on reality. That evening, I decided to make a fire. I knew it was risky, as it could attract unwanted attention, but I needed the comfort of the flames. As I sat by the fire, watching the sparks dance and flicker, I felt a little bit safer, but the feeling was fleeting. I still couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I looked out into the darkness, beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. The trees seemed to press in on me, their shadows looming like menacing figures. I imagined eyes staring back at me from the darkness, cold and malevolent. I was all alone, surrounded by the vast, silent forest, and I felt utterly vulnerable. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was a faint rustling in the undergrowth, just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It sounded like footsteps. I grabbed my pistol, my hand shaking. I pointed it towards the darkness, my finger on the trigger. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the beating of my heart. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps had stopped. Had I imagined them? Then I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. It was a fleeting glimpse, a dark shape moving between the trees. But it was enough. I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out there, watching me. I fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, shattering the silence. I hoped it would scare whatever was out there away. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I was terrified. The shadow disappeared. I didn't see it again. but I knew it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, my pistol clutched tightly in my hand, my eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for the shadow to return. I didn't sleep a wink. The long night crawled by, each minute an eternity. With the first hint of dawn, a sliver of pale light creeping through the trees, my fear began to recede, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get out of the woods. I packed my camp with trembling hands, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the eyes of whatever was out there were still watching me, even in the daylight. As I started hiking, I noticed something strange. A small, almost imperceptible trail of disturbed earth and broken twigs ran parallel to the main path. It was as if someone had been following me, staying just out of sight. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I was being tracked. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get to civilization, to safety. I imagined a ranger station, a small town, anything that represented human contact, warmth, and protection. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees, once a source of beauty and tranquility, now seemed menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, trying to grab me. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was a suffocating blanket, broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart. My hallucinations worsened. I saw figures moving in the periphery, dark shapes flitting between the trees. I heard whispers on the wind, my name called in a low, guttural voice. My mind was playing tricks on me, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. I stumbled on, driven by a primal fear, a desperate need to escape. I didn't know how long I had been hiking. Time had lost all meaning. I was running on pure adrenaline, fueled by terror. Then, I saw it. A flicker of orange in the distance. Firelight. My heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Was it a campfire? Or something else? As I got closer, I could hear the crackling of flames and the faint scent of wood smoke. I approached cautiously, my pistol drawn. I peered through the trees, trying to make out what was there. It was a campfire, but it was unlike any campfire I had ever seen. It was huge, blazing fiercely, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees. And there was someone sitting by the fire. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was silhouetted against the flames, their features obscured by the flickering light. They were sitting perfectly still, their back to me. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. As I did, the figure moved. They turned their heads slightly, and I saw their face. My blood ran cold. It was a face I would never forget. It was wild, primal, barely human. The skin was covered in dirt and scratches, the hair matted and tangled. The eyes, though, were what terrified me the most. They were wide, unblinking, filled with an animalistic hunger. And then I saw it. The figure was wearing something familiar. A pair of shorts. My shorts. The ones that had gone missing from my pack. The figure smiled, a slow, chilling grin that revealed yellowed teeth. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. I knew. This was the creature that had been following me, the presence I had felt in the woods. This was the stalker. I raised my pistol, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I fired a warning shot into the air. The figure flinched, startled by the noise. They scrambled to their feet and, with surprising speed, disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait to see if they would return. I turned and ran, my legs pumping, my lungs burning. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, a small, isolated building on the edge of the forest. I burst through the door, babbling incoherently to the startled ranger. I told him about the missing items, the feeling of being watched, the figure by the fire. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. He told me that there had been reports of a wild man living in the woods, a recluse who had shunned civilization. He said they had tried to find him, but he was elusive, a creature of the forest. I didn't stay at the ranger station long. I couldn't. I needed to get back to the city, back to the world I knew. I needed to leave the forest behind, to forget the terror I had experienced. But I knew I would never truly forget. The face in the firelight, the wild, unblinking eyes, would forever be etched into my memory. The forest had revealed its secrets to me, and they were dark and terrifying. I had glimpsed the primal, the untamed, the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of our civilized world. And I knew, deep down, that it would always be there, waiting, watching in the shadows. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've stepped into the darkness and made it back, this time. But who knows what's waiting for you when the night falls again? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you dare, share your own terrifying experiences in the comments below. Until next time, sleep tight,